Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents In the Shelter, Finding a Home in the World, by Pádraig Ó Tuama, narrated by Pádraig Ó Tuama.
De Paul Grámachrí agus Rúthachí Cara Criúil. Bíon siúlach scéalach, travellers of tales to tell. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure. The very cave you were afraid to enter turns out to be the source of what you were looking for. The damned thing in the cave that was so dreaded has become the centre. Joseph Campbell. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. Annie Dillard. Gloria Dei est vivens homo. Irenaeus of Lyon. Hello to the world. I didn't grow up in a city, but I was born on the edges of one. My parents moved to the countryside when I was 5, so I learned to love fields and long walks. But I always loved the idea of the city. The word city comes from the old French cité, which itself comes from the Latin word civis, from which we get the word citizen. The world is in the citizen, whether the citizen is in the city or the forest. But I, taking long walks nightly in the country, longed to be in the city, because there I hoped I could meet the worlds that the country couldn't contain. Of course, when I moved to the city, I found that the city couldn't contain those worlds either. I met a Finnish woman once who had spent years dreaming of moving to Dublin. When she got there, she was initially distracted, but then, after a while, she said that she realised that she brought herself with herself, and no city was big enough to meet that. Once I was in New York City. For 10 years I'd imagined that I would become a priest there. When I finally managed to visit the city, it took 10 minutes to realise that my plans would change. I didn't like the priests, and they wouldn't like me, but I loved the city. I was left with the question, what do I do now? I walked the city. I walked until I got lost, and when I was totally lost I went down into the subway and took a train and felt even more lost. Eventually I found my way to the subway underneath Grand Central Station. I'd nowhere to be and hours to waste, and I couldn't make my mind up about what to do, either with the day or with my life. Both seemed open and both were intimidating. I heard some music from a side of the station and went to look. In the corner was a woman. She was wearing a dress and fancy shoes and a coat and a small hat. Her face was clear and bright, and she was singing along to recorded music. It must have been a well-known church song, because all of the others around her were joining in with the chorus, a chorus that just repeated Alleluia over and over like a jazzy psalm. She had a lovely voice and moved with style and rhythm, smiling and singing and repeating Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. I didn't feel like singing, but she was so full of life that I couldn't leave. She was singing about the woman in John's Gospel who makes her way to the well during the hottest time of the day and at the well meets Jesus. It's a story I love because the characters are so rich and lively. When Jesus asks her to draw some water for him, she tells him he shouldn't be speaking to her. When he says she should ask him for the water of life, she says that he is no bucket. They speak anyway, and she discovers herself in the words of a stranger. So there I was, in the belly of the city, hearing songs about a story that I loved on a day when everything seemed to be dying. I was the only white boy surrounded by black women twice my age, and they were singing Alleluia, and I was crying and thinking that maybe everything wasn't lost anyway. Hello to the city. Hello to the little worlds we live in. Another time in another city I was walking at night time. It was Melbourne, a city that was my home for 4 years. It was dark, and as I was walking towards Flinders Street train station, I saw a man who seemed distressed. I stopped to ask if he wanted directions, and as he replied, it was clear that he was deaf. I owned a sign language dictionary and had perused it for years, and so I was delighted to practice my limited knowledge. He told me he was French and had only arrived in the city that day. I spelt I-R-I-S-H, and he asked me how I knew sign language, and I got lost in the spelling. He was looking for the train station, and I said to come with me. We walked, and I stumbled through his fluent language. He was happy to have met someone who could speak a few words of his language, and I was delighted at the happy chance to talk. He was pure charm. At one point, I was trying to say something in sign, and he laughed and did an imitation of my cumbersome signing. When we said goodbye at the train station, he grabbed both of my slow hands in his, and I felt his warmth and fluency, and we shared a joy of being human in the city. Earlier on that night, I'd been walking around the city, and someone had come up to me and asked if I knew the truth of Jesus Christ. I told him I wasn't interested, but he must have reckoned that a refusal is an engagement, so he persisted. I even told him that I had a Bible in my bag and that on good days I tried to read it, and he asked me whether I had the proper translation of the Bible in my bag. He asked me to say a prayer with him, but I wouldn't. I've lied enough in my life. The reason I was walking in the city late at night was because only 2 days before I'd received a phone call from my mother. We always spoke on a Sunday night. It was winter in Melbourne, so there was a 9-hour difference between Ireland and Australia. My mother's phone call came at the wrong time. My childhood best friend was dead, she told me, dead from suicide. And then there was nothing else to say. Nothing else. He'd taken his life and his sadness and his burdens and his body and hung them all in a place where we used to play. So I'd done the only thing I knew to do. I went to the city and I walked in the city. At one point, I walked into a bookshop and found The Lord of the Rings, a book I love. I turned to the place where Gandalf is dead. The bereaved companions have found their way to Lothlorien, and on the first night they hear the others sing laments for the wizard. The laments are in Elvish, and when some ask Legolas, the elf, to translate, he refuses, saying that the grief was too near, a matter for tears and not yet for song. I read it over and over and over, standing at a bookshelf, holding a heavy book in a shop in the middle of the city. Hello to the need for shelter. Hello to the stories that shelter us. Narrative Theology, number 1. And I said to him, "Are there answers to all of this?" And he said, "The answer is in a story, and the story is being told." And I said, "But there's so much pain." And she answered plainly, "Pain will happen." Then I said, "Will I ever find meaning?" And they said, "You will find meaning where you give meaning." The answer is in a story, and the story isn't finished. Chapter 1. Hello to Here. When travelling, I carried 3 books, one each of poetry, fiction and religion. I also bring a diary. In 1998, everything fell apart. At that stage, I'd been ill for a year, dizziness, aching, exhaustion, insomnia, nausea, and I was finding it impossible to hold it all together. I didn't know what to do. My friend Wendy said, "I'm driving to France. Do you want to come?" I'd had to leave my job because I was too ill, and now, while I didn't have much money, I had enough for a few months. So, for no other reason than it was the first idea in a year that had felt good, I went. I went with some clothes, a book of poetry, a book of religion, and a book of fiction, and I ended up in Thésée, that little monastery in eastern France known for generosity and light. It was spring, and I stayed in the House of Silence at Thésée. I was there with 20 other men. It was a sunny Lent. I enjoyed bites of chocolate and small buns of bread for breakfast, and showed up for prayer and reflection. During your 2 weeks in silence here, don't spend too much of your time reading, one of the Thésée brothers said. Make sure you spend time in silence and stillness. I read The Lord of the Rings in a week. It wasn't my first time reading it. You could call it rhythm or habit, but I've always reread books, sometimes re-beginning the first page once the last page had ended. For years, I accompanied exam time with readings from Middle-earth because the anxiety of exams was calmed by the richness of Sam's courage. So in France, it was no surprise that I'd put Tolkien in the bag I'd packed. I was standing in what felt like the ruin of myself, and I had brought a fiction to hold me together. It was a good fiction, and it worked. It held me together. I had a copy of the Bible too, but I was doubting my decision to bring it. I didn't feel like I could read it. I felt that I could read it if I were someone else, someone more holy, healthy, and heterosexual. I felt caged in by my readings of the Bible, so it lay in the bag with the wool sweaters, underwear, and guilt I'd packed. Tolkien wrote, "I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or, if he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls?" I was, in a sense, wanting to escape a religious belief that said I shouldn't be ill, I couldn't be gay, and I couldn't go on. And so, in a monastery, surrounded by rules, silence, and four-part harmonies, I was finding myself in some kind of prison. I did what made the most sense at the time. I turned to myth. Myth is, after all, what is more than true. My favourite poem from David Wagoner is Lost. Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. The truth of this poem is an old truth. There are places you wish to go. There are places you desperately wish you never left. There are the places you imagine you should be, and there is the place called here. In the world of Wagoner's poem, it is the rooted things, trees and bushes, that tell the truth to the person who is lost, the person with legs and fear who wishes to be elsewhere. The person must stand still, feel their bodies still on the ground where they are, in order to learn the wisdom. This is not easy wisdom. It is frightening wisdom. In Irish, there is a phrase, eragla na hagla, that translates as, for fear of fear. It is true that there are some things that we fear, but that there is, even deeper, a fear of fear. So we are prevented from being here not only by being frightened of certain places, but by the fear of being frightened of certain places. So stand still, the poet advises. Learn from the things that are already in the place where you wish you were not. Hello to the fear of fear. Hello to here. Anyway, it was Easter week. In Taizé, we had morning reflections of about 10 minutes each, every morning. We had a monk there who could deliver his short talks in English, French, German, or Spanish. He would ask, moving casually from language to language, which tongues he should use in order to be understood by everyone. He translated himself with ease, and his English was as rich in poetry as his French. On Holy Thursday, the day that we should have been reading about the Last Supper, he instead turned to a reading for Easter Sunday. He turned to the Gospel of John, particularly reading the text where Jesus arrives in the upper room wherein the disciples had locked themselves for fear. The Taizé monk read the text, asked someone else to read it in Dutch, someone else in Norwegian, and then he noted that when Jesus arrived in that room of fear, he greeted his disciples by saying, "Peace be with you." Part of the concern in rereading a text often is that in so doing, you read less and recognise more. You glide over familiar words. Or, to be more particular, you glide over familiar presumptions, and so, with time, you aren't reading what's there, you're reading what you think is there. The Taizé brother suggested that we pause for a moment and consider the words, "Peace be with you," which the resurrected Jesus says to his locked-in followers. The Taizé brother said that, in a real sense, we can read that as hello. After all, it's the standard greeting in Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. He smiled and asked us all to say hello in our own language. There were many languages in the room. Then we approached the text again. The disciples were there, in fear, in an upper room, locked away, and suddenly the one they had abandoned, and perhaps the one they most feared to be with them, was with them. And he said, "Hello." Hello to you in this locked room. In many circles of faith or spirituality, there's generous time given to the testimony, the telling of the story of conversion or reconversion, of enlightenment or change. It is a moving thing to listen to the testimony, but testimony, if told or heard unwisely, can be a colonization of a single experience into a universal requirement. Jesus fed me when I was hungry, we hear, and those who are hungry feel bereft. Jesus healed me when I was sick, say the healthy, and the burdened feel more burdened. Meditation cured me of depression, say some, and others make plans to hide the Prozac. Upon whom is the burden of words? I don't know. I don't think there is an answer. I cannot dampen gladness because it will burden the unglad. But I cannot proclaim gladness as a promise that will only shackle the already bound. Faith shelters some, and it shadows others. It loosens some, and it binds others. Is this a judgment of the message or the messenger, the one praying or the prayer prayed? I don't know. Hello to what we do not know. What I do know is that it can help to find the words to tell the truth of where you are now. If you can find the courage to name here, especially in the place where you do not wish to be, it can help you be there. Instead of resenting in others' words of gladness or pain, it may be possible to hear it as simply another location. They are there, and I am here. At another point, we will be in different locations, and everybody will pass by many locations in their life. The pain is only deepened when the location is resented, or, even worse, unnamed. Hello to here. By the time I arrived with my bag and my books at Thésée, my relationship with religion had worsened my sense of myself. At that point, my relationships with others were guided by what I now recognize as desperation. Could you like me? I asked over and over and over. I asked it of friends. I asked it of colleagues. I was desperate to ask it of authority and to beg for acceptance from the God that I was trying to love. Somehow, in the simplicity of that moment in a monastery in France, something became clear. I might be locked in somewhere. I might be looking to Middle-earth to save me, but I could do something else, something altogether brave and simple. I could begin to greet the truth, to greet the here of now. This required me to recognize I might have to ask myself some questions, and that I would need to tell myself some truthful answers. That day, I skipped the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer. I walked and found that I was able, for the first time in years, to tell the truth to myself without shame. I'm falling apart. I was, like so many people, able to face truths about home only when I was someone foreign. I was an Irishman in France, moving between English and school French and processing phrases in Irish. I was writing about loneliness one day, the time available, and I realised that the word for loneliness in Irish, uigneach, shares a root with the word for grave, uig. And another day, while listening to a talk from one of the Thésée monks, I realised that I was repeating round and round and round like the Hail Mary, the French words, je me déteste. I hate myself. Or at least that's what I wanted to say. I knew that the adverb me went before the verb, but I busied myself wondering if I'd translated the phrase correctly, because I wasn't sure that the French me could be both me and myself. What does it mean when you interrupt self-loathing to consider the grammatical conjugation of the words you're using to abhor yourself? It means that words have power. So anyway, there I was, a lonely youngster with languages longing and the love of God all haunting me. I was beginning to greet a place called here. There was a lot to greet, and I'd only just begun. Hello to time. At the end of the Gospel of John, the narrator says that if everything done by Jesus of Nazareth were to be written down, then the world itself would not contain the books. James Joyce tried to write the world of a day, and the book is very, very thick and very, very long. How long would the book of our day be? How many chapters can describe mundanity? How many words are needed to tunnel along the radius to the heart? And how many words to climb back to the skin? I'd come to Thésée with some clothes, a book of myth, a book of poetry, a book for writing in, and the books of the Bible. I was using the first 3 with regularity and relief. I was seriously considering abandoning the Bible because my readings of it caused such anxiety. One day I found myself asking myself why, if I disliked it so much, I had it with me. I didn't know the answer, but I knew that sometimes, read in a certain light, I found the heart swelling with courage. I knew that when the brother in Taizé spoke, I found space for my own life, and I knew that somehow, if I could only settle into a different reading of truth, I could find in prayer words both generous and fierce. I remember reading through an old National Geographic magazine. There was a story in it about a photojournalist who was returning after many years' absence to Papua New Guinea, where she'd grown up. She'd taken pictures of a remote area of jungle. When she'd lived there as a child, her parents had worked as medics or missionaries, I forget the details, among a nomadic tribal group who moved between different homelands depending on the season. She recalled the language of her youth, a language she'd learned from her friends. There was no word for hello in this local language in Papua New Guinea. Instead, upon seeing someone, one simply said, "You are here." The answer, as I recall it, was equally straightforward. Yes, I am. Whether by fact or fiction, it remains that for decades I have thought of the words, "You are here," and "Yes, I am," as good places to begin something that might be called prayer. Where is it that we are when we pray? We are obviously in the place where we are. However, we are often in many places. We are saying to ourselves, "I should be somewhere else," or "I should be someone else," or "I am not where I say I am." In prayer, to begin where you are not is a poor beginning. To begin where you are may take courage or compromise or painful truth-telling. Whatever it takes, it's wise to begin there. The only place to begin is where I am, and whether by desire or disaster, I am here. My being here is not dependent on my recognition of the fact I'm here anyway, but it might help if I could learn to look around. In the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus feeds a hungry crowd using some bread offered by a small boy. Then he leaves and a storm comes. The events, often told separately, seem to me to be a part of a broad storyboard about absence, presence, and the changing nature of circumstance. Initially, Jesus is on a mountainside. The Gospel writer makes sure to note that there were a great number of people and a great deal of grass. The people are hungry and a small boy offers bread. The people are made to sit on the grass, and somehow when the boy's bread is shared, there's enough for them all. It is, in a certain sense, a picnic. Much time can be spent wondering whether it was a miraculous multiplication of the small boy's small offering, or whether his offering was the small beginning of a great generosity. Hello to the great generosity. Whether it was a miracle of multiplication or the miracle of generosity is a matter for speculation. Either way, the people ate, and either way, they wished the Lord of the hillside, the Lord of the picnic, the Lord of generosity to become their king. Small wonder I'd have joined them in their desire. The picnic king had an eye for the little voice, and he understood that people were in need. Jesus seems to be aware of their desire to make him king, and he is made anxious by this desire. He escapes. He withdraws to the top of the mountain, and the people exit the narrative. The disciples, however, do not. They descend to the shoreline, and there descend into their boat, and there they wait. As they wait, a storm begins to brew, and the storm begins to come close. Still they wait. Eventually, as the storm comes even closer, they decide to move out into the water, to cross the lake while they can. They meet the storm. Hello to the storm. I imagine that if the storm were serious enough to cause fishermen worry, then it must have been a dark storm that covered the lights of the night sky, a storm that blocked the light of the moon. Their boat would have been tipping and dipping and falling hither and thither. They were on the waters of chaos, and there was no light even by which to see the chaos. All they knew was their feeling, and their feeling was the unsteady wood beneath their feet, wood of a boat on an uncertain sea. In the midst of this, they see something or somebody on the water coming toward them, and now they seem really afraid. The voice calls to them, "It is I." But how could they even see what they couldn't see? And how could they keep their gazes straight when the surface upon which their boat floated was an uncertain and unruly stormy surface? It was Jesus walking on the waters that rocked them, walking where he shouldn't walk, being with them in the here of their fear. The Gospel writer is a poet as well as many other things. Even though the disciples are in a rocking boat on a stormy sea, they make to take the water walker into the boat of uncertainty. As they begin to take him into their boat, they immediately reach the place that was their destination. It is as if to say that only in the middle of a storm can we find a truth that will steady us. But we know that sometimes we search and search and search for what we cannot see, and still it stays dark and stormy. Hello to the dark storm. And this twin story is a story of a life. Sometimes it's stormy and sometimes there's bread to share. Sometimes our picture of God is a food-sharing man on the side of a grass-covered hill. Other times it's more frightening than we can imagine. We may prefer one story over another, but they both happen over and over, again and again. While I am in the storm, someone else is on the hillside, and someone else is waiting in a boat, watching waves begin to form. The symbol for the Gospel of John in the Book of Kells is the eagle who can hover above and can descend quickly in a small moment. One time I invited a group to reflect on the images of the picnic and the sea of the Gospel of John, imagining the whole event happening all at once, and each of us an eagle hovering above. Descending to the place that moves them, they are further invited to move into a part of the story, to describe it from the inside. The sights, the smells, the fears, the surprises. One man said that he found himself walking with Jesus, distributing the bread from a little satchel that he found he had on his shoulders. His heart swelled with the love of the Lord, of the green grass, and the joy of feeding where there had previously been hunger. A woman said that she had been on the boat and had seen the Lord of Chaos walk across the waves. She now found herself at the shore, giving words of calm to those waiting on the storm. "Don't worry," she said. "It's only a storm. Do what you need to do." A name is only shorthand for something much bigger, a collection of letters that will be pronounced, abbreviated, translated, and mispronounced. It's a metaphor for life. To name something is to begin a relationship with it. To name something is to abbreviate it into a short sequence of syllables, and if that naming is inadequate, it's a poor start. When Merry and Pippin get lost in the forest in the second book of The Lord of the Rings, they find themselves in the company of a talking tree. They quickly share their names, both formal and abbreviated, and their kind. "Who calls you hobbits?" the Ent, for that is what he was, asks. "We call ourselves hobbits," they reply, with an ease interpreted by the talking tree as hastiness. The Ent is both alarmed and amused at how quickly they tell him their names. However, he will not tell them his name. For one thing, it would take a long time. My name is growing all the time, and I've lived a very long time, so my name is like a story. Real names tell you the story of the things they belong to in my language, in the old Entish, as you might say. It is a lovely language, but it takes a very long time to say anything in it, because we do not say anything in it unless it is worth taking a long time to say and to listen to. To name something is part of the project of being human. The poet or poets who wrote the 2 stories of creation at the beginning of the first book of the Hebrew Bible understood that. God, who has many names, creates and names, creates and names, creates and names. When the first man, the Adam, is created, God invites him to give names to what is created, and this he does. Whatever the Adam called every living creature, that was its name. The verb to call in Hebrew is yikra. Like the English verb, it can mean many things. To summon, to proclaim, to be invited. To be named is to be summoned into being, and to name is to participate in this project of living. Hello to the power of names. I imagine that much of our desire to not name a place is because we fear that in naming it we're giving it power, and by giving it power we're saying that we may not escape. It's a valid fear. There are some suburbs of hell that we wish we'd never visited, and we need...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?